Bitterroot Valley, Montana. The morning fog clung low to the earth, thick as a blanket of pale smoke. Tom Callahan stood on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, gripping a chipped coffee mug gone cold in his hands. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke drifting from the stove inside. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful wail of a Union Pacific freight train carried across the valley, fading against the mountainsides. He was used to mornings like this, gray, quiet, uneventful. But this morning wasn't like the others. By the northern fence line, half lost in mist, stood a figure. At first, Tom thought it was just a stray elk wandering down from the timberline, but as the fog shifted, his chest tightened. It wasn't an elk. It was a horse. Its coat was drenched dark from the rain, black-brown with a streak along the back that shimmered silver under the weak dawn light, a scar that looked almost carved by storms. On its shoulder, a shallow wound crusted with dried blood. The animal trembled, but didn't run. Instead, it stared past the farm, past Tom's eyes locked on the jagged outline of the Bitterroot range. Tom froze. He hadn't laid a hand on a horse in years, not since the fire, not since Sam. His younger brother's face flashed in memory smoke curling in his hair, his voice calling through a wall of flame Tom hadn't broken through in time. Horses had been Sam's love, not Tom's. For Tom, they were a wound made flesh. He muttered under his breath. Wrong damn place to wander into. From behind him, a voice cut the stillness. "Dad, what's going on?" Grace stood in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, her jacket too thin for the chill. The instant her eyes found the horse, she gasped. "He's hurt." Before Tom could stop her, she ran. "Grace, stop!" Tom's bark cracked through the morning air, but his daughter was already at the fence, arm outstretched. And then the impossible happened. The horse didn't shy, didn't snort, didn't bolt. It lowered its head, breath steaming in the cold, and pressed its muzzle toward her open hand. Tom's throat closed. How could this animal, wild-eyed, bleeding, scarred, let her touch it? Grace whispered, her voice soft, almost reverent. "It's okay, boy, you're safe now." Tom forced himself forward. His boots sank into the wet earth as he closed the distance, slow, wary. He saw details now, the cracked hooves, the matted mane, the faint line across its face where a halter had once been. This wasn't some Mustang out of the hills. Someone had cared for it. Someone had left it behind. Grace turned, pleading eyes on her father. "We have to help him." Tom cursed under his breath. He tugged his gloves on, fingers stiff. For years he had avoided this moment, avoided barns and bridles, avoided memory. Yet here he was again, his hand reaching out almost against his will. The horse flinched, then went still. Its skin was hot under his palm. With practiced, reluctant motions, Tom cleaned the wound with iodine, wrapped a strip of gauze tight around the shoulder. The years melted away back to nights when Sam had shown him how to tend a rope burn, how to dress a cut. His stomach knotted with every remembered gesture. Grace's hand traced the scar across the horse's back. "We should call him Thunder," she whispered. "That mark, it looks like a storm burned it there." The horse flicked an ear, as though answering. Tom tied off the bandage with a jerk and stepped back. "He stays the night, that's all. In the morning, he's gone." But Grace was already smiling, stroking Thunder's neck like she'd known him forever. That evening, the farmhouse kitchen felt too small. The wood stove clicked as it cooled. Grace chattered about Thunder's eyes, how he seemed to watch the mountains as if listening to some secret call. Tom pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "Don't get attached. He's not ours. Somebody will come looking." Grace frowned, stubborn. "And what if no one does? What if he's meant to be here?" Tom slammed his spoon down. "Meant to be?" His voice cracked harsher than he meant. "Life doesn't work like that, Grace. Horses don't wander in with some grand plan. They get lost. They get hurt. And we—" He stopped. The knot in the wood table swam in his vision. Grace's voice fell to a whisper. "You never talk about Uncle Sam." Tom stiffened. The fracture inside him throbbed. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat. "I'll check the fences." The cold slapped him as he left. Inside the barn, Thunder stood silent in the stall, eyes fixed toward the north window that framed the silhouette of the mountains. His whole body leaned that way, taut, listening. "You don't belong here," Tom muttered, "and neither do I, not anymore." But the horse didn't look away. That night, Tom wandered the hallway of the farmhouse, past framed photographs, his late wife smiling in a field of sunflowers, young Grace laughing atop a pony Sam had led, his own younger face unlined by grief. He touched the glass, then pulled back like it burned. Outside, a sound broke the silence, not the restless stomp of livestock, something sharper, a low whinny, drawn out, insistent. Tom went to the window. Thunder stood in the paddock, refusing rest, refusing food. His entire frame pointed north. His breath rose in white plumes against the starlit sky. Tom's hands clenched the window frame until his knuckles whitened. Not again. I'm not going back to that life. And yet, the horse's posture whispered otherwise. Tom turned from the window, jaw tight. He started back down the hallway, then froze. From the barn came a new sound. Not random shuffling, not panic. A steady rhythm. The scrape of hooves against dirt. One strike, then another, then another. He imagined the line being carved, deliberate, relentless, pointing north into the wilderness. A shiver crawled up his spine. What was this horse trying to show him? The next morning came without sunlight. Heavy clouds sagged low over the Bitterroot Valley, smearing the sky in shades of lead. Tom Callahan trudged into the barn, boots crunching against frozen earth. Thunder stood exactly where he had left him, not resting, not eating, his eyes locked through the slats of the north window. The straw lay untouched. The water bucket barely rippled. Grace arrived at his side, jacket zipped, cheeks flushed with cold. She leaned against the stall, her hand brushing the horse's damp mane. "He's not sick," she whispered. "He's restless. He wants to go somewhere." Tom shook his head, dragging the muck fork across the straw. "He's a horse, Grace. Horses pace. That's what they do." But even as he said it, he knew she was right. Thunder's movements weren't the nervous circles of a trapped animal. They were measured, precise, each hoof striking the dirt in a straight line toward the north. Like a compass, like a message. That evening, headlights swept across the gravel driveway. A dented pickup pulled up, rattling as it idled. Doctor. Laura Bennett, the town's only veterinarian, stepped out with a box of supplies under her arm. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes softened by years of listening to ranchers argue with their own silence. "Thought I'd check on your patient," she said, as Tom met her at the barn. "Grace told me you've got a stray." Grace beamed. "His name's Thunder." Laura crouched, stethoscope against the horse's flank, her hand running down the scarred shoulder. "Healing fine," she murmured. Then she frowned, pushing back the mane to reveal a faintly knotted braid. "That's no accident. That's a therapy braid. I haven't seen one of these since I volunteered at Willow Creek riding camp." Tom stiffened. "That place closed 10 years ago." Laura nodded. "Funding cut. But I remember the horses. They were trained to work with kids, special kids. Horses like him weren't just animals. They were lifelines." Grace's eyes widened. "So he came from there?" "Maybe," Laura said softly. "But if so, it means he belonged to someone who wanted him safe. And if he found his way here," she glanced at Tom. "Maybe it's not an accident." Tom bristled. "I don't believe in fate. He's just lost." But even as he said it, Thunder shifted. His ears pricked forward. His muscles quivered. His whole frame turned again toward the north, body rigid, listening. Laura stood back slowly. Wherever he came from, he hasn't forgotten. Later that night, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a map spread in front of her. The yellow light of the oil lamp flickered across her determined face. "Dad," she said, tracing a finger along the tree line north of their farm. "Willow Creek Camp was up here, wasn't it? Near the old logging roads?" Tom grunted, folding his arms. "That land's been abandoned for years. Nothing up there but ruins." "Then why does Thunder keep looking there?" Grace pressed. "Because he's stubborn. Like you." Grace's eyes flashed. "Or maybe because someone needs us to find them." Tom slammed his palm on the table, making the lamp tremble. "That's enough. We've got enough problems without chasing ghosts into the mountains." The silence that followed was heavy, thick. Grace didn't back down. She simply folded the map, her voice quiet but steady. "Maybe ghosts are all we've got left." 2 nights later, Tom woke to the sound of hooves. Not frantic, not panicked. Steady, relentless. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Frost bit at his face. In the paddock, Thunder was pacing again north, always north, wearing a groove in the frozen ground. His breath rose like smoke, his body trembling but refusing to stop. Tom gripped the fence rail, the rough wood cutting into his palm. "What do you want from me?" he muttered. The horse lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes fixed on Tom with an intensity that made his chest ache. Behind him, a soft voice stirred. "Dad!" Grace stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes reflected the same light as the horse's. "Maybe it's not about what he wants. Maybe it's about what you're afraid to see." Tom's throat tightened. He turned away, unable to answer. The following morning, as he checked the irrigation ditch along the frozen alfalfa fields, a government truck rolled up the drive. Ranger Ethan Cole stepped out, his green uniform stiff in the cold. Ethan was a man Tom had known since boyhood, steady, deliberate. The kind who could read the land like scripture. Heard you've got a new horse, Ethan said, glancing toward the barn. That's not why I'm here, though. Hunting season opens tomorrow. North Slopes will be crawling with rifles. If that animal's leading you into the wilderness, think twice. The forest isn't forgiving. Tom bristled. We're not going anywhere. But Ethan studied him with a gaze that stripped past the lie. You've been restless, Tom. I can see it. Just remember, people vanish in those hills. That night, as snowflakes drifted from a leaden sky, Grace sat near the stove, braiding strips of twine with quiet concentration. Tom sat across from her, papers spread before him, overdue bills, foreclosure warnings, water rights disputes stamped with the name Granite Developments, the company that had been buying land across the valley. They're going to bleed us dry, Tom muttered. We'll lose the farm by next summer if they get those rights downstream. Grace didn't answer right away. She tied off the braid and laid it on the table between them. Maybe Thunder's showing us something bigger than the farm. Tom's jaw clenched. You think a horse is going to stop a developer? Grace met his eyes. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Maybe not, but maybe he knows where the truth is. Hours later, Tom couldn't sleep. He pulled on his coat and walked out into the barn. Thunder stood waiting, head lifted toward the mountains. Tom approached slowly, the lamplight flickering over the scar across the horse's back. He rested a hand against the warm hide, his throat tight. You think you know something I don't, he whispered. The horse didn't move, didn't blink, just breathed. And for the first time, Tom felt it, not imagination, not fantasy. Direction, purpose. At dawn, Tom saddled his old quarter horse, Buck, for the first time in years. Grace's backpack sat ready by the door. Laura arrived in her pickup, supplies packed tight. The three of them stood at the edge of the property as snow began to fall, light but steady. The mountains loomed ahead, dark, silent, waiting. Thunder pawed at the earth, breath steaming, his entire body angled north. Tom gripped the reins, his chest a knot of resistance and resignation. All right, he muttered. Show us. The horse surged forward, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. The trail swallowed them into shadow, and just as the farm disappeared behind them, Thunder stopped dead, ears pricked, muscles rigid. Grace's breath caught. What is it? From the woods ahead came a sound. Not wind, not snow. The faint crack of an axe splitting wood. Someone was up there. The snow deepened as they climbed. Buck's hooves crunched through the crust, while Grace followed close, her breath fogging the air. Laura trudged behind, medical kit slung across her shoulder. And, always ahead, Thunder. The scar-marked horse pulled at the lead rope with steady determination, ears forward, nostrils flaring, as though catching a scent no human could. He wasn't wandering, he was guiding. By midday, the clouds had thinned enough for shafts of sunlight to pierce through the fur canopy, laying strips of gold across the trail. Grace shaded her eyes, scanning the ridgeline. Dad, she whispered. Look. Through the trees, a thin column of smoke curled into the pale sky. Tom stiffened. Smoke in these mountains didn't come by accident. They pushed onward until the trail bent into a hollow. And there it was, a cabin tucked against the slope, its roof sagging but intact. A faded coat of green paint clung stubbornly to the door, peeling in long strips like bark. Thunder stopped, head high, body quivering with recognition. Grace clutched Tom's arm. He knows this place. Tom swallowed hard. His instincts screamed caution. Cabins this deep weren't abandoned without reason. Stay behind me, he murmured. They dismounted, tying the horses a safe distance away. The clearing was eerily still, save for the faint crackle of fire from within. Tom stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. He knocked once. Silence. Then a rustle, the scrape of a chair. The door groaned open an inch, hinges squealing. The smell of smoke and something sour seeped out. Inside, the light was dim. A frail figure lay beneath a quilt on a narrow cot. Her hair was silver, tangled, her skin pale as paper. Yet her eyes, when they fluttered open, were startlingly bright. Who are you? Her voice rasped. Tom knelt instinctively, his soldier's instincts for triage kicking in. Name's Tom Callahan. We're not here to hurt you. You need help. The woman's gaze shifted past him, and then her lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. Scout, she whispered. Tom turned sharply. Thunder Scout had stepped halfway into the cabin, head lowered, eyes locked on her. For the first time since they had found him, the horse stood utterly still. The woman's hand lifted, shaking, reaching. Scout pressed his muzzle into her palm with a tenderness that made the air itself go quiet. Grace gasped. She knows him. Tears slipped down the woman's cheeks. I thought I'd lost you forever. Her voice broke. I'm Ruth Alder, He was my therapy horse, my scout. Laura moved quickly, checking Ruth's pulse, urging water to her lips. Grace stayed at her side, clutching Ruth's hand like she'd known her forever. Tom stepped back, chest tight. Pieces were falling into place he hadn't wanted. This wasn't just a stray horse. This wasn't chance. Scout had led them here. As Ruth regained strength, her story spilled out in fragments. Years ago, she had run Willow Creek Camp, a sanctuary where children with disabilities learned to ride, to trust, to heal. Scout had been the bravest of them all. But when funding dried up, the camp collapsed. Horses sold, children sent away. Ruth stayed, unable to abandon the land. I had nothing left, she whispered. So I stayed. Scout was taken. I thought I'd never see him again. Her hand gripped Tom's sleeve with surprising strength. But he remembered. They always remember kindness and cruelty. On a table in the corner, a stack of yellowed folders sat bound with twine. Ruth nodded toward them. There's something you need to see. Tom hesitated, but Grace's insistent look pushed him forward. He untied the stack, spreading the brittle pages across the table. Deeds, surveys, contracts stamped with state seals, and one document that made Tom's breath catch. His grandfather's signature. William Callahan. The paper outlined water rights, agreements drawn decades ago that bound the creek through their land as a communal resource, untouchable by private hands. Tom's throat tightened. If these papers were valid, Granite Developments didn't stand a chance. Ruth nodded faintly. Your grandfather left copies with me when the camp closed. He said if his family ever needed them, I'd know when to hand them back. Grace's eyes shimmered. That's why Scout brought us here. He knew. Tom shook his head slowly, the weight of it overwhelming. He had spent years believing he'd inherited nothing but debt and failure. And now this. Not just land, not just water. A legacy. That night, the fire burned low. Ruth dozed under quilts, her hands still tangled in Scout's mane, as if afraid he'd vanish. Laura sorted through the documents with quiet precision, her brow furrowed. Grace sat close to the horse, whispering secrets into his ear. Tom sat at the table alone, lamplight washing over his lined face. He traced his grandfather's signature with a finger, remembering the stern voice that had once guided him through fields, through storms. You knew, he whispered. You knew I'd need this. Scout stamped softly in reply, as if answering in a language older than words. By dawn, snow began to fall again, thicker this time, heavy flakes that muffled the forest. Tom stepped outside, boots sinking deep, the air sharp with the metallic scent of a coming storm. He looked back at the cabin. Through the cracked shutters, he could see Ruth, frail but alive, Scout standing guard by her side. Grace slept curled against the horse's neck, safe in a way she hadn't been in years. Tom should have felt peace, but unease gnawed at him. The storm wasn't the only thing closing in. From somewhere in the valley below, faint but rising, came the growl of an engine. Not the friendly rumble of Laura's pickup, not a ranger's truck. This was deeper, heavier. A vehicle forcing its way up the mountain road. Tom's stomach tightened. Someone else was coming. But who? And what did they know about the cabin and the papers inside? Snow thickened by the minute, fat flakes swirling down like ash over the clearing. The cabin groaned in the wind, its faded green door rattling in protest. Tom Callahan stood outside, his coat collar turned up against the cold, eyes fixed on the sound rising from below the grind of an engine laboring up the mountain road. Grace appeared in the doorway, Scout's halter rope still looped in her hand. Dad, who is it? Tom shook his head. Stay inside. Laura joined them, her jaw tight. Could be hunters, could be worse. The growl of the engine grew louder until headlights slashed through the storm. A black SUV crawled into the clearing, tires spinning in the snow before crunching to a stop. Its sleek body gleamed out of place in the wilderness, a predator dressed in steel. The driver's door opened. Trent Kavanaugh stepped out. Tom's chest tightened. He knew the face from the papers, the man behind Granite Developments. A smile, too smooth, a suit coat, too sharp for this storm. A lawyer trailed him, briefcase in hand, spectacles already fogging in the snow. Trent spread his arms as though greeting an old friend. Tom Callahan, I was hoping we'd meet. Tom planted his boots, every instinct flaring. You've got no business here. Trent's smile never faltered. On the contrary, this valley is my business, and I hear you've stumbled on something that complicates it. His gaze slid toward the cabin. Old papers, old promises. They won't hold up. Grace tightened her grip on Scout's rope, her breath visible in sharp bursts. Laura stepped forward, voice cold. She's sick. This isn't the place. Trent's eyes flicked to her, dismissive. Dr. Bennett, isn't it? You always were sentimental. He turned back to Tom, voice lowering. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Hand over the documents. I'll see to it you keep your farm. Tom's jaw clenched. Those papers aren't for sale. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Kavanaugh has county commissioners lined up behind him. Permits, investors, development plans. You can't fight this. Better to take the deal. Trent stepped closer, snow hissing off his coat. His eyes sharpened, cutting through the false charm. You've already lost enough in your life, Callahan. Don't lose everything else. For a moment, the storm itself seemed to hold its breath. Then thunder shifted, stamping the snow, a low rumble in his chest. Grace pressed closer to him, chin lifted in defiance. Tom looked at her, at Laura, at the cabin where Ruth lay, breathing shallow beneath blankets. Then he turned back to Trent. My grandfather made sure of this valley. His word still stands. You'll leave us be. Trent's smile cracked, just for a second. You think a dead man's words will save you? He snapped his fingers. The back door of the SUV opened. Another man stepped out, broad-shouldered, hood pulled low. Not a lawyer, not a businessman, a warning. Laura's hand brushed the pepper spray at her belt. Grace's fingers tightened on the rope. Tom's pulse thundered in his ears. Trent lowered his voice to a whisper meant only for Tom. Accidents happen in storms like this. Roads are unforgiving. Cabins burn easy. His smile returned, colder than before. I'd hate to see your daughter caught in the middle. Tom's stomach twisted. Rage rose sharp and hot, but fear knotted through it. Before he could answer, a new sound broke the tension. The crunch of tires. Another vehicle. Every head turned as a green Forest Service truck rolled into the clearing, its tires biting through the snow with calm persistence. Ethan Cole climbed out, ranger hat pulled low, clipboard under his arm. He scanned the scene. Trent's SUV, Tom standing firm, Laura tense, Grace clutching the rope with Scout pressed close behind her. Morning, Ethan said evenly. Everything all right here? Trent's smile reappeared instantly. Of course, Ranger. Just a friendly visit. Some confusion over land records. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Confusion's my business. Documents, please. Tom reached into his coat, pulling the brittle papers Ruth had entrusted to him. He handed them over without a word. Ethan flipped through quickly, brow furrowing as he recognized the federal seals, the signatures. These look authentic. They'll need verification in town, but until then... His gaze cut to Trent, hard as stone. You have no claim here, not today. Trent's jaw tightened. His lawyer murmured something about injunctions, litigation, but Ethan's voice carried finality. Take it to the judge. Until then, you're trespassing. For the first time, Trent faltered. The smile slipped. He glanced at Tom, something darker settling in his eyes. A promise, unspoken. Then he turned, snapping for his driver. The SUV's tires spun, flinging slush as it backed out of the clearing and disappeared into the storm. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. Ruth coughed weakly, Laura kneeling to steady her. Grace hovered close, whispering comfort. Tom stood by the fire, fists still clenched. His heartbeat refused to slow. Ethan studied him. You all right? Tom exhaled, voice low. He won't stop. No, Ethan agreed. Men like that never do, which means you'll need to be ready. Tom stared into the flames. Ready. He wasn't sure he'd ever been ready for anything since the fire that took Sam, but the weight in his coat pocket, the documents, the signature of his grandfather anchored him. Scout shifted by Ruth's side, ears flicking toward the mountains beyond the cabin. His body was taut again, restless, as though the confrontation had only sharpened his urgency. Grace noticed. She touched her father's arm. Dad, he still wants to go. Tom looked at the horse, at Ruth pale beneath her quilt, at Laura's tired eyes, at Ethan waiting with quiet patience. Something larger than Trent Kavanaugh was at play here. Something tied not just to land and law, but to memory, to legacy, to the scar carried on the back of a horse who refused to stop listening north. That night, snow hammered the roof, the storm swallowing the mountains in white silence. Tom couldn't sleep. He sat at the table, Ruth's documents spread before him, the lamplight flickering against brittle pages. His eyes drifted to the leather-bound journal Ruth had pulled from a chest beneath her bed. William Callahan's handwriting filled its pages, dreams of keeping the valley's water free, visions of horses carrying broken children toward healing. One line burned into Tom's mind. We can't stop loss, but we can decide what survives after it. Outside, Scout stamped in the snow, his body angled once more toward the ridgeline. His breath rose in steady clouds, ears pricked, waiting. Tom clenched the journal, the weight of his grandfather's words sinking deep. Maybe the valley wasn't the only thing that needed saving. Maybe there was something else out there, hidden beyond the ridges, that Scout hadn't yet revealed. As dawn broke pale and thin, Tom stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in silence. And in the snow at the edge of the clearing, fresh tracks led away from the cabin, deep, deliberate, not made by deer or elk. Boot prints, leading into the trees. Tom's chest tightened. Who else was already out there? The morning after the storm broke, white and silent. Snow lay thick over the clearing, muffling every sound but the groan of pines bending under their new weight. The cabin's chimney sent a thin trail of smoke into the pale sky, but inside, the air was taut with unease. Tom Callahan stood just beyond the green door, his boots sunk into drifts. The chill stung his lungs as he stared at the ground before him. Boot prints, not animal tracks, not random wanderers. Clear, heavy impressions pressed deep into the snow. They began at the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the tree line. He crouched, brushing frost from the nearest print. The size, the stride, it wasn't Trent Kavanaugh. Too deliberate, too cautious. Someone else had been here. Behind him, Grace's voice broke the hush. "Dad?" She stood in the doorway, blanket wrapped tight, Scout pressed close behind her. The horse's breath streamed in silver clouds, his ears flicking nervously toward the forest. Tom rose slowly. "Go back inside." But Grace didn't move, her eyes fixed on the trail of footprints, wide with fear and something else. Recognition. "They're fresh," she whispered. Laura joined them, tugging her coat tighter. She crouched beside the prints, frowning. "At least 2 sets, one heavier, one lighter. Could be a man and—" She trailed off. Tom's voice was flat. "A child." The 3 of them stared at the tracks, vanishing into the shadows of the pines. Inside, Ruth Alder stirred on her cot. Her voice rasped through the smoke-tinged air. "They're not strangers." Tom turned sharply. "You know who's out there?" Ruth's eyes glistened, weary but steady. "I thought they'd be gone by now. But maybe the storm kept them close. A girl came once, months back. Thin, quiet. She left food at the fence and never spoke. I thought I dreamed her." Grace leaned forward. "She was real?" Ruth nodded faintly. "And she wasn't alone. Someone older, maybe her father. He never showed his face. But the girl? She looked like she belonged here." Tom's gut twisted. If others were hiding in these mountains, living off scraps, the storm could have stranded them in danger. But another thought crept darker. Were they connected to Trent? Laura's brow furrowed. If Ruth saw them, then they know about this cabin. About her. About Scout. The air thickened with unspoken tension. Tom exhaled hard. "Then we find out what they want." The snow crunched underfoot as Tom, Laura, and Grace followed the prints into the forest. Scout trailed close, his body taut, nostrils flaring as if he already knew where the trail led. The pines closed around them, the silence oppressive. The tracks wound through a narrow pass where the snow was deeper, then curved toward a ravine where a creek cut under sheets of ice. Grace touched her father's arm, whispering, "They're heading toward the old logging road." Tom's jaw tightened. That road had been abandoned since before she was born. Now it looked like a scar in the forest, half swallowed by snow and time. At a bend, Laura crouched suddenly, hand raised. She brushed aside a cluster of broken branches. A makeshift shelter. Logs stacked against a boulder, tarps frozen stiff, ash blackening the snow. Someone had been here recently. Tom's chest tightened. He moved closer, crouching to examine the fire pit. The ashes were still warm. Grace's whisper trembled. "They're close." Scout pawed at the snow, ears twitching, body angled deeper into the trees. Laura's eyes swept the shadows. "We need to move carefully. If they're desperate, they could be dangerous." Tom straightened, scanning the silent woods. "Or they're running from something just like we are." They followed the trail another half-mile before the forest opened into a narrow meadow. The snow here was trampled, disturbed by movement. At the far end, 2 figures stood frozen in place. A man in a ragged coat, his beard frosted with ice. And beside him, a girl no older than 12, her face pale, eyes hollow, clutching a small pack to her chest. The man stepped forward, raising one hand cautiously. "We don't want trouble." His voice was rough, cracked. Tom held his ground. "Then why were you watching the cabin?" The man hesitated, glancing down at the girl. His voice broke softer. "Because of the horse." Scout stepped forward then, nostrils flaring, ears pinned to the pair. The girl's eyes widened. She dropped the pack and stumbled into the snow, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Scout!" she cried. Her voice cracked with desperate relief. Grace gasped. "She knows him too." Tom's breath caught as realization struck. This wasn't coincidence. Scout had led them here for a reason. The girl threw her arms around the horse's neck, pressing her cheek to his scarred back. Scout lowered his head, nuzzling her hair with gentle recognition. The man's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. She wouldn't stop talking about him. Said he came to her dreams, said he was still out there. He shook his head. I thought she was imagining things. Laura's voice softened. She wasn't. Grace stepped closer, her eyes shining. What's your name? The girl sniffed, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Ellie. And him? Tom asked. The man straightened, wary. Daniel Hayes. We used to come to Ruth's camp, years ago. My daughter rode Scout then. When it closed, everything fell apart. I lost work. Lost our place. We've been moving since. His voice faltered. She wanted to find him, said he'd remember her. I didn't believe her, until now. Tom studied them ragged, fragile, yet bound by something undeniable. Scout had carried memory across years, across storms, to bring them together again. But unease still gnawed at him. If Daniel and Ellie were here, hungry and hiding, how long before Trent's men discovered them too? They returned to the cabin as daylight thinned, Ellie clinging to Scout's mane, Daniel limping with exhaustion. Ruth stirred at the sight of them, her frail face breaking into something close to joy. You found them, she whispered. I thought the mountain had swallowed them whole. Laura tended to their frostbitten hands, heating broth over the fire. Grace sat with Ellie by the hearth, their laughter small but alive in the heavy air. Tom stood at the window, staring into the darkening forest. The storm had passed, but something heavier hung over them. Scout paced near the door, restless, ears twitching north again. Daniel noticed, his voice low. He's not done. If he brought you to us, there's something more, something he hasn't shown yet. Tom turned sharply. More? Daniel nodded. Ruth's camp wasn't just for healing kids. She kept things there. Records. Proof of what this valley was meant to be. The kind of proof men like Kavanaugh would kill to bury. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dim cabin. Tom's jaw tightened. Then where is it? Daniel's eyes flicked toward the ridgeline beyond the trees, shadows black against the fading sky. The camp. What's left of it. Scout hasn't forgotten the way. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Tom lay awake by the table, Ruth's documents spread before him, Daniel's words echoing in his head. Proof. Hidden at the ruins of the camp. Scout stamped outside, his breath clouding the glass, body angled north as though waiting for permission. Tom's gaze shifted to Grace, curled beside Ellie on the cot, the two girls asleep at last, their faces softened by the fire's glow. For the first time, Grace didn't look alone. He looked back at Scout. The horse's scar caught the lamplight, gleaming like a mark left by something greater than chance. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe the horse wasn't finished. Tom exhaled slowly, the decision already heavy in his chest. Tomorrow, they'd follow Scout to the ruins. But as his eyes drifted back to the window, his stomach turned. Out past the tree line, faint but unmistakable, a light flickered. Not firelight. A lantern, moving, watching. The cabin walls creaked under the pressure of the cold night. The fire had burned down to embers, throwing long shadows across Ruth's frail frame as she slept. Grace and Ellie lay curled on their cots, breathing softly, Scout's steady presence pressed close outside the green door. But Tom Callahan couldn't sleep. His eyes kept drifting to the window, to that faint glimmer beyond the trees, a lantern swaying against the darkness, its movement too purposeful to be a trick of light. Laura noticed him stiffen. She rose quietly from her chair, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You see it too? She whispered. Tom nodded. Someone's out there. Daniel stirred from his seat near the hearth. Exhaustion clung to his features, but his voice sharpened with fear. Trent's men, has to be. No, Tom said slowly. They'd come with trucks, noise, guns. Whoever's out there doesn't want to be found. The lantern flickered once more, then vanished into the pines. Tom's chest tightened. Whoever it was, they weren't gone. They were waiting. At dawn, the storm-battered valley woke under a pale sky. Snow glittered across the trees like glass. Scout stamped impatiently, pawing at the ground, ears pricked north again. Grace slipped out of the cabin, pulling her coat tight. He's ready, she said, brushing frost from Scout's mane. Tom rubbed his hands together against the cold, gaze flicking between his daughter and the horse. The lantern still haunted him, but so did Daniel's words. Proof hidden at the ruins of Ruth's camp. If they wanted to stop Trent Kavanaugh, they needed more than faded signatures. They needed evidence that could stand against money and power. Laura shouldered her medical bag. If we're going, we'd better go now. Weather'll turn again before nightfall. Ruth, weak but lucid, beckoned them close. Her hand trembled as she pressed a folded paper into Tom's palm. A map, she whispered. What's left of it? Follow Scout. He'll know the way. Her eyes glistened. But be careful. Not everyone who remembers that place remembers it kindly. The trail was steeper than Tom remembered. Pines closed tight around them, their trunks rising like black pillars in the snow. Buck followed reluctantly, his breath steaming, while Scout surged ahead with uncanny purpose. Grace walked beside him, one hand on his neck, her boots crunching in perfect rhythm with his hooves. Ellie trailed close behind, her eyes shining with the kind of recognition only a child could carry. Laura brought up the rear, her gaze sweeping the trees. Every snapped branch, every echo of shifting snow set her teeth on edge. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. From here, the farmland looked small, almost fragile against the sweep of wilderness. Tom paused, his chest tightening at the sight. He had spent years binding himself to that land, to crops and debts and bills. But now, following a scarred horse into the mountains, he wondered if survival had always meant something more than keeping soil under his boots. Grace tugged his sleeve. "Dad, look." Ahead, the snow was disturbed not by deer, not by elk, boot prints. Again. And this time, fresher. Laura crouched low, brushing frost from the impressions. "At least 2, maybe 3. They're following the same path we are." Tom's pulse hammered. The lantern from last night hadn't been a ghost. Someone was tracking them. The ruins appeared by late afternoon. What had once been Willow Creek Camp now stood in silence. Collapsed barns, a half-buried corral. A sagging wooden arch still clung to its lettering, Hope Riding Center. The paint was chipped, the boards gray with rot. But even in ruin, the place breathed memory. Ellie gasped. "I remember this, the swings, the arena." She ran to the fallen fence, brushing snow from its rails. "It's real." Scout pawed the ground, nostrils flaring. He pulled Tom forward, leading him past the ruins toward the main cabin at the far end of the clearing. Its door hung crooked, but it was still standing, its windows cracked but intact. Tom's stomach tightened as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and silence. Old posters of smiling children on horseback still clung to the walls. Edges curled. A pile of tack lay rotting in the corner, bridles stiff with age. And on a shelf near the hearth boxes of files, water-stained but preserved. Laura lifted the lid of the nearest box. Inside were binders full of records, photographs, donation ledgers, medical waivers signed by parents. "This is it," she breathed. "Documentation. Proof the camp existed, proof of what it stood for. If we can connect this to the land deeds." Grace held up a photograph, her fingers trembling. It showed a young Ellie atop Scout, Ruth walking beside them. Ellie's smile was radiant, her eyes alive in a way Tom had never seen until now. Daniel's voice cracked. This could change everything." But before Tom could answer, the floor creaked. He turned sharply. At the doorway stood a man, hood pulled low, lantern in hand. The same lantern from last night. The intruder stepped inside, his breath curling in the cold. His eyes scanned the group, lingering on the files, the photographs, on Scout himself. Tom squared his shoulders. "You've been following us. Why?" The man's voice was low, gravelly. "Because you don't understand what you've walked into." Laura stepped closer, her jaw tight. "Then tell us." The man dropped the lantern onto a nearby table, its flame flickering against the cabin's warped beams. His face was gaunt, his beard streaked gray. "My name's Owen Mercer." His gaze locked on Tom. "Your grandfather was my brother." Tom's blood ran cold. "That makes me your great-uncle." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Grace's eyes widened. "Dad," Owen's voice grew sharper, haunted. "William Callahan didn't just build this camp. He hid things here. Things he never wanted in the wrong hands. And now, because you've stirred the ashes, Trent Kavanaugh isn't the only one hunting for them." Tom's fists clenched. "What things?" Owen's eyes flicked to Scout, then back to Tom. "Records, evidence, enough to bury men like Kavanaugh, or enough to bury this valley in fire." The lantern flickered, casting Owen's shadow long across the ruined cabin. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Tom. "You think this is about saving your farm. It's not. It's about survival. Because the moment you took those papers, the moment that horse led you here, you inherited every enemy William made." Grace clutched Scout's mane tighter. Laura's eyes narrowed. Daniel paled. Tom felt the weight of his grandfather's journal heavy in his coat pocket. The words about loss and survival burned hotter than ever. But before he could speak, a sound split the silence. The distant rumble of engines. Not one, several. Grace's face drained of color. "Dad, they found us." The engines grew louder, their growl reverberating through the ruined beams of Willow Creek Camp. Dust trembled from the rafters. The boxes of files stacked against the wall seemed suddenly fragile, like evidence waiting to be burned. Tom Callahan's jaw tightened. Grace stood beside Scout, her small hand gripping the horse's mane, her eyes locked on her father. Owen Mercer's shadow flickered against the walls in the lamplight. His face was lined, his eyes sharp but haunted. "They're here for the same thing you are," he rasped. "The proof, the camp's records, the truth your grandfather left behind. If Kavanaugh gets his hands on it, the valley is finished." Tom's pulse hammered. "Then we make sure he doesn't." Owen's mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace. "Words are easy, holding the line that's harder." The first SUV appeared in the clearing beyond the broken corral, headlights slicing through the falling snow. Another followed, then a third. Engines cut, doors slammed. Voices carried across the cold air, men's voices, sharp and deliberate. Laura's face hardened. "We can't outgun them, Tom." Daniel Hayes staggered forward, one hand braced on the wall. "But maybe we can outlast them. This cabin, there's only one way in." Tom glanced at the door. It wouldn't hold against much. The walls sagged, beams rotted. But still maybe, for a time, it could. Scout shifted uneasily, ears pinned. Grace pressed her forehead against his neck, whispering, "It's okay. We're here." But Tom wasn't sure. The knock came hard. Then a voice. Smooth, cold, unmistakable. "Callahan, Trent Kavanaugh. Hand over the files, hand over the horse. Do that, and maybe your daughter walks out of here." Grace's breath caught. She clung tighter to Scout. Tom's blood boiled. "You're not getting either." Trent's laughter rang sharp against the storm. "You think a rotting cabin will protect you? You think some old papers matter? I've already bought half this county. All I need is the rest." Laura moved to the window, peering through a crack. "3 men outside, maybe more. They're circling." Owen's jaw clenched. "We can't stay penned in. They'll torch it. Then we move," Tom said. They worked fast. Laura bundled the most vital folders into her medical bag. Grace and Ellie wrapped smaller documents in blankets, tying them with twine. Daniel steadied himself with effort, insisting on carrying a box, despite his limp. Scout pawed at the ground, restless. He tossed his head toward the back wall, as if urging them on. Grace's eyes widened. "Dad, he wants us to follow." Tom hesitated, then pressed against the warped boards. To his surprise, one shifted under his hand. A section of wall gave way to reveal a narrow passage, an old service corridor leading toward the corral. Owen's eyes narrowed. "William built this. For escape." Trent's voice rang again from outside. "Last chance, Callahan." Tom shoved the board wide. "Move!" They slipped into the dark corridor, just as the cabin door shuddered under the weight of a boot. The girls squeezed through first, Daniel stumbling after, Laura clutching the bag to her chest. Scout moved with surprising grace, pressing sideways to fit, his body warm and steady in the tight space. The passage emptied into the snow behind the corral, the forest only yards away. Tom glanced back. Through the cracks, he saw men break into the cabin, flashlights stabbing through the dark, voices barking orders. Trent stepped in, his silhouette framed by firelight. His voice was venom. "Find them. Burn everything else." Tom's chest clenched. They had minutes, maybe less. "Go!" he hissed, urging Grace and Ellie toward the trees. They plunged into the forest, snow swallowing sound. Branches whipped against their coats. Laura pressed close behind the children, Daniel limping but refusing to slow. Scout surged forward, leading them with uncanny precision, weaving between pines, finding ground where the snow was firmest. He was more than a guide, he was their compass. But the shouts followed, men crashing into the trees, flashlights stabbing the dark, beams sweeping dangerously close. "Split up!" one shouted. Tom pulled Grace against his side, his heart hammering. "Stay with Scout, no matter what." She nodded, eyes wide but resolute. Owen appeared beside them, his breath steaming. "There's an old line shack 1/2 mile up the ridge. We can hold there." Tom's legs burned as they pushed uphill, every muscle screaming, but adrenaline carried him. Scout never faltered, his stride relentless. Then a gunshot cracked the air. Snow exploded near Tom's boots. Grace screamed. "Keep moving!" Tom roared. The line shack loomed at last, half buried under snow, its roof sagging but intact. They barreled inside, slamming the door against the wind. Laura dropped her bag on the table, her hands shaking as she checked the girls for wounds. Daniel collapsed against the wall, clutching his side, breath ragged. Scout pressed into the shack behind them, his body filling the narrow space, his presence steadying even as the storm raged outside. Tom leaned against the door, chest heaving. Outside, flashlights bobbed through the trees. Voices barked, closer now. They won't stop, Laura said, voice low. No, Tom agreed, his fists clenched. But neither will we. Owen stared at him, eyes hard. You want to save this valley? Then you stop running. You face him. Tom met his gaze, fury and resolve twisting together. Then we make our stand. The shack shook under the force of boots outside. The men had found them. Grace clung to Scout's mane, whispering a prayer. Laura ready to flare she'd found in the corner, her hand trembling. Daniel steadied himself with a rusted shovel, jaw set. Tom stood tall, William Callahan's journal in one pocket, the valley's future in the other. His voice was low, steady. Whatever happens tonight, we don't give them this land, not 1 inch. The door rattled, splintered. Then, silence. Tom's breath caught. Why had they stopped? A new sound rolled through the valley, low, guttural, growing louder by the second. Not engines. Thunder. Real thunder. Carried on a storm that hadn't been there moments before. And Scout's ears pricked, his eyes blazing with a fire Tom had never seen before. Grace's whisper trembled through the hush. Dad, what's coming with the storm? The storm broke over the ridge like the crack of heaven itself. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled across the valley, and the men outside the line shack faltered. For one suspended moment, the mountains themselves seemed to roar in defiance. Inside, Tom Callahan stood with his daughter pressed close, Scout's presence towering over them. His pulse hammered in his throat, but for the first time in years, it wasn't fear that gripped him, it was resolve. The door shuddered under fists and boots, shouts rang outside, but then the storm drowned them, thunder bellowing so loud the walls trembled. Snow crashed from the trees in avalanches, burying footprints, swallowing light. Scout stamped once, twice, as though answering the thunder with his own. Grace whispered through trembling lips, "He's not afraid, neither should we be." Tom closed his eyes. He wasn't the man who hid anymore. He wasn't the man who let loss hollow him out. His grandfather had built this valley on truth. Ruth had preserved it, and Scout, this scarred, relentless horse, had carried it through storms and years to find him now. It was his turn to stand. When the storm cleared, silence reigned. The men were gone, their threats buried under snowdrifts. Only broken branches and faint tire ruts remained, half swallowed by the valley's winter breath. Tom, Grace, Laura, Daniel, Ellie, Owen, they all stood at the threshold of the shack, staring into the stillness. Laura broke it first. "They'll be back. Men like Kavanaugh don't vanish with one storm." Tom nodded. "No, but we won't be hiding when they do." Spring came late to Bitterroot Valley. Snow melted slow, streams swelling, meadows greening under reluctant Sunday, and with it came something the valley hadn't felt in years: movement, renewal. Word spread that William Callahan's deeds had been verified. The valley's water was secured, untouchable by developers. Ruth Alder's camp records were authenticated, her work honored. The Callahan Whitfield Foundation was born, named for William and Ruth, dedicated to preserving the valley and reviving Willow Creek as a therapeutic ranch. The old ruins were rebuilt plank by plank. Volunteers poured in from Hamilton, from the farms and ranches that had felt the pressure of Kavanaugh's shadow. New stables rose, fresh paint brightened old beams. Children laughed again in the meadows where silence had lingered too long. And at the heart of it all stood Scout. Thunder to Grace, Scout to Ellie, legacy to Tom. The horse carried them forward, his scar shining in the sun like a banner of survival. The opening ceremony was small but fierce with pride. Ruth, frail but smiling, sat wrapped in quilts as Grace and Ellie led Scout through the new corral. Laughter and applause rippled as the horse tossed his head. As if he knew this moment belonged to more than himself, it belonged to everyone who had believed. Laura spoke, her voice steady. "This isn't just about healing horses. It's about healing people, families, a valley." Daniel, his limp permanent but his spirit unbroken, stood beside his daughter as she stroked Scout's mane. Owen, silent but present, kept to the edge, his eyes unreadable as he watched his brother's vision reborn. And Tom looked out across the land his grandfather had fought for, the land he had almost let slip away, and felt something he hadn't in decades: home. That evening, after the last of the volunteers had gone, Tom lingered in the corral. Grace slept in the farmhouse, Ellie curled beside her. Laura tended to Ruth. The valley was quiet, dusk stretching long shadows across the grass. Scout stood still, gazing north again, ears twitching, body taut with that same restless energy Tom had seen on the first night. Tom frowned, stepping closer. "What now, boy? Haven't you done enough?" The horse's breath steamed, slow and steady. His eyes gleamed with something Tom couldn't name. A weight settled in Tom's chest. Scout hadn't just brought them here to rebuild. He hadn't just carried memory. There was still something more, something unfinished. The wind shifted. In it, faint but chilling, Tom thought he heard an echo. Not thunder, not storm. Engines. Far off. Low. Crawling back into the valley, Tom gripped the fence rail, his knuckles whitening. His gaze locked on the horizon, where the ridges melted into shadow. The storm had given them time. The foundation had given them hope, but the fight wasn't over. Grace's voice called faintly from the farmhouse. "Dad, are you coming in?" He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. In a minute. Scout stamped once, ears still fixed north, as if warning him. Tom's heart pounded. The valley was theirs for now. But in the hush of twilight, with the taste of smoke still lingering in memory, he couldn't shake the question. Was the storm truly over, or had it only just begun?